Hello everyone and welcome back. In today's video, we are diving into a game-changing feature in Power Automate, saving data into multiple Dataverse tables with transaction control. What does that mean? Well, if anything goes wrong during the process, the entire transaction can roll back, keeping your data safe and sound. So let's get started and automate with confidence. So how do we set up this transaction data flow? We'll create a new flow in Power Automate. The key here is to ensure that we handle multiple tables simultaneously, all while safeguarding against errors. I have a simple model-driven app. An app has two tables, buyers and sales. If I go back to the Power Apps homepage and I click on tables, I can see this is the buyer table, and then I can see a sales table here as well. So the buyer table have very minimal columns, the buyer name and the email address of the buyer. And if I go back to tables and if I look at the sales table, I have sale as a text value, sale amount, sale date, and buyer. So this buyer is a lookup column. The idea here is that when you create a record in a buyer via Power Automate flow, you want to make sure the record is also created for sales. And if any of these records not created, the whole transaction should fail. So for example, if the buyer record is created, but the sales record is not created, then buyer record also should be rolled back and not created in the Dataverse table. So to do that, I will go to make.powerautomate.com, and then from the left-hand menu, I will click on create. I will select instant cloud flow in this example. I will give this flow a name. I will just call it buyer and sales transaction. I will manually trigger the flow and click on create. Now the first thing we need in the flow is to get a GUID for the ID. So when we create a buyer, we are giving it a GUID, an ID, and we will use the same ID in the sales record to look it up to the buyer's record. So I will click on the plus sign, add an action, and I will initialize a variable. I will give this variable a name. I'll just call it var ID, and the type is going to be string. And in the value, I will choose a regular expression, which is GUID. So I will select GUID regular expression to generate a unique ID for this variable. Click on add. Next, we need to bundle creation of the buyer record and sales record into a transaction. So for that, I will click on plus sign, add an action. I will search for perform a Changeset action in Microsoft Dataverse. I can't see it here. If I click on see more, I can see the other actions like perform a bound action, perform an unbound action, but I cannot see any action related to the change set. So that action is not actually available in the new designer. We need to save the flow and navigate back to the old designer in the Power Automate to use that action. So I will click on saved, and from the top right corner, I need to use this toggle button to switch back to the classic designer. So I will do that. This will reopen the flow in the classic designer. Okay, so now if I go click on new step, and if I search for perform a change set request, you can see that perform a change set request action is available in the old designer. I will select that. Now this creates a transaction. So anything we'll do inside this change request will work as a transaction. So if something fails, everything just roll back. So I will click on add an action. First, we will create a record in the buyers table, and then subsequently we'll create a record in the sales table. So as you can see, while we are inside perform a change set request transaction action, we can only see these three actions. So you can either add a new record, delete a record, or update a record. So these are the only Dataverse action available inside a transaction. I will click on add a new row. I will search for the table. Our table name is buyers. I will select that and then click on show advanced option. You can see other option for the table. For now, I will just add buyer name. I'll just call it Peter, and email address. I will add an email address, and that's it. I won't add anything else in this table. And for the buyer unique identifier for this entity, as I explained earlier, we have created a variable with the GUID. So we'll provide a unique identifier here If we don't provide it, it will automatically create one. But because we need to create a sales record attached to this buyer, so we can pass this GUID ID to the buyer's lookup column in the sales table. So for this, I will go to add dynamic value and I will select var ID variable. Now next, within the transaction Changeset action, I will click on add an action and let's create sales record now. So add a new row. Let me just rename the first row to buyer record and I will sale record. And in the table, I will select sales table and then the sale, this is just a text box. I will call it laptop sale amount, let's say 500, and advanced option, we can see the other things like sale date, reason and stuff. But the only thing I'm interested in is the buyer. So we can look up to the buyer record. Now for this lookup column for the buyer in the sales table, we need to get the schema value from the buyer's table. So if I go back to the tables and I will go to the buyer, if you click on the properties, you can see there are some advanced options and you can see the schema name and the logical name here as well. The schema name is the prefix underscore buyer with a B capital and logical name is a prefix underscore buyer with small letter. But I've tried it with this one and it did not work. So for me, I need to go to the tools drop down and copy set name. So this is the name we need to use in the Power Automate to patch the value to a lookup table. So I will copy set name and then if I go back to the flow and if I paste that, you can see it has a plural S in here. So buyers. So we have the prefix underscore buyers. Okay. And then if I do / and next we're going to use the same variable which we used to create the buyer record. So that's the variable ID. I will select that. So this is how you will update a lookup column in Dataverse table. Okay. So I will click on save and test the flow. So I will on the top right corner click on save. The flow is saved successfully and then I will click on test and then I will select manually and then click the test button. I will click on run the flow. Click on done. Now the flow ran successfully. If I go back to the app and if I refresh it, I can see the buyer is created. And if I go to sales table, I can see the sale record is also created. Okay. Now we need to maybe change this buyer record to someone else. So let's say Alex, and then the email is going to be Alex as well. And now we have a sales record, which is, let's say iPhone, and then we change it to 400. Let's add another sales record. So we have one buyer record and let's have another sales record. But this time the second sales record, we will purposely do something with it so it fails. And then as a result, we are expecting that it will not create the first sales record and also it will not create a buyer record because they are all part of a transaction. So I will click on add an action and then I will select add a new row and I will select sales table again. Click on show advanced options and then for sale, this time I will say VR and then sale amount is 600 and the buyer, as you know that we can use the copy set name to patch it to the lookup column. So I will do that and / var ID. But we want this action to fail. So what we can do is we can just do something like this, or we can provide a table name which does not exist. Okay, so this should fail now. But as a result, it should not create a buyer record. It should not create a sale record because the last record is failed in that transaction. So I will rename this to sale 2 record just for our reference. Now let's save and test the flow. So I will save and click on test. I will run the flow manually and run the flow. Click on done. Now you can see the flow ran fail. And as you can see that this record was skipped. This one was skipped because there is an issue with the third record in the sales. Hence, the first two record creation steps were skipped because they are all part of the transaction. Now, if I go back to the app and refresh it, you will not see any new buyer or any new sales record created. Let's correct that issue and then we will see that it will all work fine. I'll click on edit the flow. So I will change this to the correct set value and then I will click on save and then test it. This time it will create one buyer and two sales records. I'll click on test, click test again, run the flow, done. Now the flow ran successfully. If I look into this transaction, we can see the records are created for the buyer and records are created for both sales records as well. Now if I go back to the app and if I just refresh on the buyer table, we can see Alex, a new buyer record is created. Now if I go back to sales table, we can see there are two records connected to Alex, which is iPhone and VR as a sales record are also created in that table. And there you have it. That's how you can leverage Power Automate to save data in transaction fashion in multiple Dataverse tables. And you have a complete rollback control over it. If you found this tutorial helpful, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel for more tips on Power Platform, and drop any question you have in the comment section below. Thank you for watching and I will see you in the next video.